Let's get to it.
We're excited here today. We've got Professor Eric Goldman with us, who wrote a scathing blog post about the CCPA and the CPRA. It goes in a very dystopian direction. The theme is Bladerunner. I tried to make it positive at the end, but it's a very really interesting conversation. So I think people will.
Yeah, man. And like Professor Goldman gets it. I really think so, man. Like his articles, speak for themselves, but like, I'm interested to talk to him about like the sideshow that is how CCPA and CPRA came to be, and like what his ideas are and the implications of that. And just kind of get a general sense of if there's a better way to do this, or if the way we're going about privacy regulation in the United States right now is ultimately good or bad. I know these are like good and evil, and we always kind of fall into these traps in our podcast, but what else is there to talk about?
The spoiler alert is he doesn't think it's good.
But he's also, but the thing is, like, I have no doubt he's going to be able to provide, a lot of meat and potatoes substance about why he's reached that point of view. He's not an uncareful person, so I'm excited to chat with him.
Great conversation. So, all right, here it is. All right, here we are with Professor Eric Goldman, professor at Santa Clara University School of Law, former GC, private practice lawyer, outspoken lover of Bladerunner. So we picked Bladerunner as the theme for the episode, and my background is the Tyrell Corporation. At your encouragement, Eric, I rewatched it. So I rewatched it. I enjoyed it. We can talk about the dystopian privacy world that we're living in now. And but one of the things that stood out to me, and it doesn't have much to do with privacy, but I do want your take on it, was the excessive eye gouging death of the leader of the corporation at the end. I had forgotten about that part, and it scarred me totally.
I don't know how you could possibly forget it, honestly.
It's a seminal moment in that movie that I had completely forgotten about, but it's there. It's there.
I think it's a metaphor about not only speaking truth to power, but taking back your identity from those who gave it to you, or those who were your progenitors. So I think there might be some kind of Oedipus complex type thing going on there. I'm not really sure. It's a pretty heavy scene.
It's a heavy scene. It's a layered movie for sure, with a lot going on. And we could start with us administering a test to you to determine if you're a robot or not. But no, I mean, yeah.
Remember that. Don't ask the question about my mother, though. Remember that.
That's right.
Pedro, do you have any intro words?
I don't have intro words other than when I see the Tyrell Corp background, I just think of ad tech. That's all that comes to mind to me is just ad tech. But
so you've called ad tech the Kanye West of data privacy. So now it's also the Tyrell Corporation. So that's a lot of things. It's a lot of things to a lot of people.
I will say every time I see that background, I just think of the Vangelis soundtrack, which I'm hoping you'll get a few snippets into this video. Just that synthesizer heavy thing going on.
We need a lot of synthesizer music playing in the intro for this one, so the production guys make a note of this.
Shout out to the Alice content guy, Gons, who's so good. Shout out to synthesizer music here, because that is running through Bladerunner for sure. All right, well, let's get started. So can you, Eric, can you just give us a little bit of background, on you, how you got into this game, as we call it, what, and how you, and we'll start there, and then we'll build on that.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Eric Goldman. I'm a professor of law at Santa Clara University School of Law. And I describe myself as an old line internet law expert. You can say internet law professor. I started teaching in 1996, internet law lawyer. I started practicing internet law in 1994. And really, I cut my teeth on thinking about internet law in the mid-1990s during what we sometimes call the height of internet exceptionalism, where we were excited about the unique, special, and different properties of the internet and how technology might positively shape our lives. So there's still a few of us around from those days, but we're kind of like the Jedi at the beginning of A New Hope. There's just not many of us left. We're still optimistic about the future of technology. I'm sorry, I'm mixing up metaphors between the Star Wars canon and Blade Runner canon. I probably should have thought of some Blade Runner metaphor there.
Oh, we just did an Empire Strikes Back episode, so
Yeah.
you're right in line here. There's a lot of good and evil going on in a lot of these discussions. So
Well, I think you said you were limited to the 80s, and A New Hope is pre-80s, so I think it's actually
It
out of
is
scope for
pre-80s.
you.
yeah, we picked Empire for that reason, just eking itself into the 80s, for sure. Um, so what was it like, I guess let's start just really quick, like, so what was it like when you were doing that work in private practice with clients and counseling clients, and was there any notion around data privacy when you started doing that, and how did it, what was the genesis for you when you were doing that, counseling clients?
So I started practicing in the Silicon Valley in 1994 with the intent of becoming an internet lawyer. So my career at the early stages really did track the dot-com boom of the 1990s. And it was a crazy time because every venture capitalist was pouring tons of money into startups, many of whom really didn't have a clear vision of what they wanted to do or where they wanted to go. But they were flushed with cash. And so I did some of the strangest, craziest, least rational, clearly uneconomic deals you could imagine between these internet companies that had more money than sense. So in that crazy time, there was a lot of experimentation about ways to slice and dice services on the internet. And there was zero question about privacy in any of that. It simply didn't come up. People took the kind of the journalistic model to data privacy. If I get the data, I can do whatever I want with it. All I gotta do is get it. Now that led to some pushback with things like the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act in 1998, where Congress said, this is just mania. These companies are feasting on kids. We can't allow that. But before laws like that came into effect, really there wasn't a lot of privacy law to worry about. And I actually had a one-pager that I would provide to clients. I called it the Grandma Goldstein's recipe for online privacy. And I did that in honor of my grandma, who was always fancy herself as the world's best chef. And so it was like, here's how to cook up all the things you need to think about with respect to privacy. And that literally fit on one page. And most of it was not statutory driven. It was, hey, here's some procedural or technical questions that you ought to be considering, not necessarily legal ones. So when you hear about discussions of the internet in the 1990s being a wild west, I don't really like that metaphor, but there's some truth to it when it came to privacy, at least. Really, there were no rules. Companies were doing whatever they possibly could as long as they got their hands on the data.
Do you fancy that you were one of the first people sort of signaling fairness and signaling that as a notional behavior to be, applying to your business practices, to your clients back then?
Certainly, I was not unique in the guidance I was providing to clients on topics like this. In fact, I probably wasn't even pushing back as hard as others were at the time. So I don't think I would be the right way to position it. A lot of what I did was simply say, guys, what are you trying to accomplish? Show me how there's even an economic use case here. And someday I would love it if we went back into the dustbins of the 1990s history and found all the really bizarre but fascinating ways that companies were trying to develop new products or services that had never been tried before. I think about some of like the reverse buying sites. I don't know if you remember those, where the idea was to aggregate enough buyers to force manufacturers to get a quantity discount. It was like completely flipping over the entire supply curve. Stuff like that, really fascinating, novel stuff. Didn't work at the time. Maybe it will work now, but boy, there was all that kind of experimentation. How can we remix everything that we're currently doing?
Let me ask you this. So you said something super interesting about like the history of privacy law and how it was really unregulated, is I guess what I took from from your point in the early 90s there, in the mid to early 90s, there's just not a lot of laws on the books for you to account for, and that you could put your privacy guidance on a one page, grandma's one pager. Let's fast forward, 30 years or whatever to, I'm gonna skip a lot here, but to CCPA, CPRA, and this kind of privacy regulation by, I don't even know what to call it, by referendum. What do you think led to going from nothing to really like citizen-driven, activist-driven regulation in California, at least? And do you think that's good or bad, having citizens kind of lead, at least in the United States, lead the way in how we're going to think about privacy regulation?
The leading question.
Yeah, so there are two different issues that I want to separate there. The first issue is how do we feel about citizen-driven democracy in general? The idea that anyone with enough money can put something onto the ballot and get their peers to vote on it. And I love that model in theory, but I don't love it in practice. I think what we see in California, and I know in other states as well, we see a lot of rent seeking where companies use that open ballot to try to advance their own economic interests. And we also see things that really are just too complicated for voters to appreciate being put to the voters. So voters just don't know what to do. And when you see these ballot guides that people write about for each other, hey, how should I vote on 16? You'll see a lot of times people write just like question marks. Maybe I'm a yes, I'm not really sure. It's just too much for any individual voter, even ones who are willing to educate themselves to really decide. That's why representative democracy has its value, that we put the power in the hands of people who will act as representatives of their constituents, but will develop the expertise in order to understand how to do it better than we as voters kind of giving an up or down, yes or no, those are the only two options on the table approach. So I generally oppose the overall open ballot process. I don't think that's the best way for us to engage in democracy. The privacy approaches in California, taking advantage of the open ballot, I think exemplifies some of the problems of the open ballot. And in particular, you called it activist driven. And I think that's an okay way of describing it, but really it's one dude who had millions of dollars to throw at this issue. And the idea that one dude with millions of dollars can try to dictate the course of something so significant as consumer privacy in a state with 40 million people, the 5th largest economy in the world. To me, that's what my grandma Goldstein would have said, Meshuggah. It's crazy. That's not the right approach. And so that part I think really bothers me. And the other thing is simply, even if we were to say we want voters to have their say on privacy, a 52-page statute that is just impenetrable by even the most sophisticated readers is really not the right question to ask voters. There's no way to summarize it or synthesize it in a way that voters can even understand what they're being asked to vote yes or no. That's the only two options that voters are being given. And for something as complicated as 52 pages, it's too much. It's not really, it doesn't really then tell us what voters truly want, because we don't believe that they actually understand what they're going to vote on.
Yeah, and then I'm just going to probe a little further. I couldn't agree more with basically everything you just said. And I look at like CPRA, for example, and if I were asked a yes or no, up or down vote on the entire proposal, as a privacy expert or so-called privacy expert, I still don't understand how it works or what the implications of some of the language in the proposal are. And to your point, I don't know how a voter could make a meaningful decision about, CPRA on their own. What about what happened with CCPA, where Alistair McTaggart, the activist / dude who proposed CCPA, essentially negotiated with the legislator, used the proposal as a negotiation to get the legislator to act, albeit hastily, and enact the law themselves, versus allow the CCPA to have gone to referendum. Do you think that is maybe, I don't know, middle ground between this idea of direct citizen driven democracy versus legislative democracy. Is that something you think is workable as a compromise, which is make these proposals and then negotiate before the ballot to try to get something done by the legislator, or is that also problematic
I
at
mean,
large and in the context of privacy? Yeah.
it's one of those ends justifies the means questions. There are some people who believe as long as we get to a good end, I don't really care how we got there. And then there are other people who say, no, the means really matter. And the process by which we develop our law and the legislature tells its constituents, we were advocating for your behalf, on your behalf, we were protecting your interests as your representatives, makes a difference. And so if the legislature is advocating that role because they basically have a metaphorical gun to their head, you must do this or you're forever sidelined in your ability to do anything to advance your client's interest, your constituents' interests. If you have that kind of metaphorical gun to the head, I think that breeds disrespect for the law. So it depends totally on where you stand on it. You might be an ends justifying the means kind of guy, in which case, that's great. You got what you wanted. But if you're not, the process matters to you, the process by which we develop our laws and that we want it to have integrity as part of us trusting it, I don't think that the whole deal that was struck between McTaggart and the legislature was will give you comfort. Two other things I just want to mention. One, imagine that same deal was struck, but on other topics where you would view the ends as hostile. And so you can just understand how that template could be weaponized by anyone who's got enough money to say, I'm going to buy my ability to put a metaphorical gun to the legislature's heads and they'll offer them a deal. But it's not really a deal. It's a deal under coercion. You could imagine thousands of different ways that same process can be weaponized for ends that you would consider to be illegitimate. The other thing I'll say is that McTaggart, God bless him, he then changed the deal. He did we're back to the Star Wars canon, right? He said, pray I don't alter it further. And then then he decided to alter the deal further. So he literally said, legislature, I'll let you do your thing. And before the legislature's actions had taken effect, he had already decided that he didn't like that deal and decided to alter it further. We really should have done a Star Wars canon. I'm so sorry. I wish I could come up with a better Bladerunner example, but boy, we got Darth Vader here now.
But let's talk a little bit about.
I would appreciate being analogized to Darth Vader either, but I'm sorry.
No, well, I feel like some of that is deserved. So it's
he's hard to come up with an analogy for because he doesn't fit the canon really. Because the other thing you have to mention is how preposterous it is for someone who's a real estate developer to be leading this effort. Like someone who has never worked in a technology company or dealt with the internet, held up completely, sort of compared against the way you laid out starting your career so many years ago, steeped in this stuff. It's preposterous.
Look,
I think it undermines expertise a little bit. Yeah,
I respect anyone who is so passionate about their views that they're willing to actually invest their time and money. It's easy for someone to say, that should be fixed. But to his credit, he's actually done something about that. What I don't appreciate is that he's treated as a bona fide expert on this topic simply by virtue of having bought the leverage that he got over the legislature. And I think over and over, he's proven that the way he explains things doesn't always track reality. And that then really muddies the water for everybody.
I think that's fair. So, I think we've discussed the tactics and their limitations to get to where we are now with CPRA coming on the ballot here in a few weeks. You've been critical of some of the substantive components of CPRA, aside from how we got to this place and how we got to this point in the first place. Give us like a 3-minute primer on what you think is wrong with CPRA.
In order to understand it, you first have to understand that the CPRA clones and revises the CCPA, the existing law that was the product of this metaphorical gun to the legislature's head. And I think that the CCPA has tons of problems with it. It's at its architectural core, what it does is it says every company must build this industrial grade infrastructure to protect the citizens' privacy rights and give them some control over that. where very few consumers will actually take advantage of that right. So it creates what I consider to be a lot of dead weight losses, that we're building all this infrastructure that very few will use. And so we all pay for that. Somebody is paying for all those investments. And the net return we're getting as a society or as an individual consumer in that society is really pretty poor. So I think the basic deal of the CCPA is not a good one for society. And there were some studies that showed how expensive the CCPA compliance was. And so that just gives us an idea, someone's paying for all this. Are we getting good return? Now, the CPRA then does a bunch of things to revise the CCPA. And I want to highlight two, one procedural and one substantive. The procedural issue is that it makes it difficult for the legislatures to ever amend the CPRA, or in a sense then to ever amend the CCPA again. That's why when McTaggart did his Darth Vader deal, he basically said, okay, legislature, I'm going to give you the power to amend the CCPA over time. And then he comes back and says, actually, I don't like what you're doing, so I'm going to take that power away. I'm going to make it harder for you to ever amend consumer privacy law again. And so whatever problems are in the CPRA, when you read those 52 pages and say like, well, that doesn't work. I know that's not going to work, but at least the legislature could fix it. Well, actually, the legislature probably can't and probably won't. And so what you see in those 52 pages is probably what you're going to see for the rest of your lives. And that's probably not really the right solution for the rest of our future. The substantive objection I have is who's going to enforce the law? Right now, the CPA is primarily enforced by the California Department of Justice. And we could talk about the limitations they have in enforcement. They have some. I don't think they're the ideal solution. But the CPRA will create a new enforcement agency that exists solely to enforce the California privacy laws. And that new agency is almost certainly going to become a skewed normative government function. It's not going to view its job as balancing all interest. It's going to view its job as cracking skulls on privacy. It's literally built into the organization's charter. And so I fear that we're going to unleash a new police on the beat who's not there to try and actually uphold good outcomes for constituents. Their job will be to find and stamp out privacy violations, whether or not that's actually really a good use of anyone's time or money.
Is that because, so what are the reasons driving that necessarily? Because they'll just be, requiring funding to do it. They'll be looking for headline enforcement actions. So what are some of what's behind that?
So there's two reasons why you would say that. First is because it's a specialized agency. Think about something like the Consumer Protection Bureau that was created. You don't go and work for the Consumer Protection Bureau if you're anti-consumer protection. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Right? The mission is in the organization's identity, and that would be the case here. The only reason why people will work at this entity, the only reason why this entity will exist is because it's designed to be the privacy cops. The other reason why is because it's literally in the charter. It says that privacy is a fundamental human right. And that's what acts as the organization's normative agenda. It's baked in there. It doesn't say, privacy is a balance between a lot of competing interests. And we want privacy, but we need to also respect that too much privacy can actually create other problems. You could imagine writing a different charter. The charter is privacy is a fundamental human right. You need to go and treat every action in the organization as if you're upholding that concern.
Let me ask you this. So there's a big delay between enactment and implementation on CPRA. It's a couple of years, right?
I'm sorry. I just want to clarify. When you say big delay, there's about 2 years, which is a non-trivial delay, but 2 years to repurpose everything that people have already done and comply with the law is actually really short. And the number of things that need to be solved by regulations that are going to be drafted over time is actually not feasible to do in 2 years. And so I just want to be clear, 2 years sounds like a long time, but in context, actually, that's moving really quickly.
I think I liked your description in your blog post. Those 2 years are the period where people like Pedro and I have to tell our companies to eat shit and do it over again.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think you'll appreciate this question. Are those 2 years meaningful for implementation? I think you already answered the question and you don't think it's enough. So then I have to believe they know this. McTaggart and his people.
Sorry, who's they?
McTaggart and his people understand that 2 years
Does
is
he
not
care?
enough.
Do they care?
That's where I'm going. Is this about giving the federal government a long time to implement a national policy that essentially might preempt CPRA, and he being the catalyst for a national privacy law? Or do you think it's just they didn't care and they're just steamrolling California?
It's a great question, because that 2-year period is going to give a window of time for the U.S. Congress to actually stop the madness in California, to put an end to this McTaggart deciding California law through ballot initiatives, which there's no reason to believe we're at the end of it. We could be, there could be plenty more coming. Who knows? And I'm sorry, just in terms of implementation, I want to make clear. So you can't really implement the law till all the rules are drafted, and that rule drafting will take likely 2 years or more. So companies won't have 2 full years with the law settled to actually implement. They will have 2 years to watch the California rulemakers develop rules, and then they'll have maybe months or weeks or less to actually implement them. So I just want to be clear about why the 2 years is actually, it isn't 2 years for the businesses to actually do the work.
That's such a great point, Eric. Like the delay on the CCPA regulations is just point in fact exactly how that played out.
They didn't finish the regulations until after they had the enforcement right. They literally missed their deadline. And I will add, if you haven't seen it, they're starting up a new rulemaking process this week, because the final regulations 2 months later are still not complete.
I was up last night until 10 o'clock on the phone with my outside counsel talking about do not sell, right? And so this is 2 more years of this and more and more and more and more and more of it. It's a great point. I can't reiterate that point you just made enough. It's for practitioners. It's like, it's critical.
Your lawyers are loving it though, because they're sending you those bills and they're not discounting them a penny.
Exactly.
Well, mine do.
Well, then keep them. They're gold.
Keep them. Andy, I need a referral. Yeah.
But can we go back to the question about will the federal government preempt this? Let's assume, quote, the best case scenario. The best case scenario is a federal preemption. Now, there's no guarantee that the federal law will actually preempt. That's one of the reasons why any deal has been held up, because there's a lot of people in Congress who think we should just pass more law, not preemptive law. So if that's the case, then we have a California law sitting out there and a non-preemptive federal law to worry about as well. In my mind, that's actually one of the worst outcomes we could get to.
Nightmare.
But let's assume that there is a preemptive federal law. What it means is all those 2 years, all that work that the regulators are doing, all the work that the businesses are doing to comply with it, that all just gets tossed into the scrap heap. Just like all the work that was done for the CCPA will get tossed in the scrap heap because people have to redo it for the CPRA. I'm sorry, not all the work. I apologize for overstating that. But some of that work has to get redone. And so there's a non-trivial chunk of work that just gets tossed. And again, it all depends on how you view the ends justify the means. If you say, you know what, this is all in service of us getting to greater privacy rights that we deserve, because privacy is a fundamental human right. And so if there's some cost along the way, no big deal. Okay, I understand that view. That's not how I view it. I view it as, this is a terrible process. This is not the way to make law. And certainly the worst way to make law is to let one guy from real estate development with millions of dollars to basically do the metaphorical gun now to Congress's head. That would be a really terrible outcome.
It also, to underscore your point, I mean, many of the companies, from honestly smaller to bigger companies, are also contending with the GDPR in a lot of cases, right? So you've got an additional similar set of requirements that's not exactly the same to contend with, right? So Eric, your point about throwing out some of the work you've done, we're all already looking at trying to harmonize a data protection program for companies, big and small, really, if you're playing in Europe. And so it just adds yet another complexity and yet another dimension when you also think through the differences and the kind of non-trivial differences between the GDPR, the CCPA, some federal United States law, whatever that may be, and the complexity
and other states
as a practitioner.
and other states. Remember, that's coming. We haven't seen it yet, and I'm a little surprised we haven't. But other states are going to pass comprehensive consumer privacy laws, and whatever they do, it's going to then compound your misery.
Well,
Tears
at least we'll have a job.
Tears in the rain.
At least we'll have jobs. We'll be busy.
It's blood money. I don't know if you want the job that way.
It's exactly right.
At my last company, one of our board members once said of a difficult period we were going through, this next period will be like crawling through glass. And
I'm sorry. When will it not be like crawling through glass?
No,
when do we get past the glass crawling stage?
This conversation is leading me in that direction. That it may be never. Not sure.
You know what makes this kind of terrible for me is the substantive issues and thinking philosophically about people's privacy interests and how to balance those with business interests and governmental interests as we move into this data-driven age that we're already in. It's so fascinating and interesting to me, and there's so many practitioners that are motivated by the merits of issues, and we have to spend, at least in my view, more of our time on the circus component of privacy governance, which is everything Professor Goldman's been talking about now, which is how we're getting to regulation and how it's a little bit of a dog and pony show. And that's unfortunate because it really is a beautiful area of law that is developing before our eyes. But unfortunately, a lot of the development is being driven by what I consider belligerent action, right? And it's not just in the United States. I mean, if you look at what happened with LGPD in Brazil, it's kind of a similar hostage situation mess. It's just, I don't know if you guys have a take on that, but it's just bittersweet to me that we're busy, but we're busy with the wrong things.
Yeah, we're going through a transitional period where we're going from the Wild West era, like I described in the 1990s, to a very fully developed set of privacy laws, not only by industry or across industries, but across countries and globally as well. And that transition period is inevitably going to be rocky and it's going to be painful. And it's the old joke goes about legislation. You don't want to be watching the sausage getting made, but we don't have a choice. We're literally getting to see all the procedural defects exposed to us at each and every stage. And it's awful. It's terrible. And that's, again, if you think that the ends justify the means, you're like, I don't really care. Go ahead and make that sausage. It tastes great. And if you're a process person, and many privacy practitioners are, they should be horrified. And many of them are horrified that this is not the right way to get to that end goal.
Let's end on a positive note if we can. Like, are we
gonna gouge each other's eyes out?
That seems like the maybe where this ends. But Pedro, you're talking a lot about how some of your viewpoint on some of these things is they don't actually help consumers create enhanced privacy rights. But what do we feel like? Are there benefits, or are we feeling over time? Consumers have gotten, obviously transparency is sort of one thing that we can talk about, but do we feel this is moving in the right direction generally, notionally, or are we just gonna continue kind of struggling?
So I feel awkward because you were trying to get me to say something positive, and I'm about to just rip out some more venom. So I just want to warn you what's about to come. And if you want to steer me in a different direction, we could do that now.
No. Let's go there. Let's do it.
Okay, so go ahead and put your asbestos earmuffs on. Look, here's the thing that really blows my mind. I understand consumers' concerns about companies' management of their private information. There's definitely reasons to be asking questions and be concerned about that. But what frustrates me to no end is that while we're spending so much energy trying to fight against the tech titans, we're not spending that same energy or more against fighting against the real threats to our well-being, to our happiness, and to our future citizenship, and that's the government. So we're not talking about how the government is misusing its citizens' data for improper purposes. And that, to me, is really where, if you were to say how we should prioritize privacy concerns, that's number one, number two, number three, number 1 through 100. And then after we get through all of that, let's talk about whether or not Google and Facebook are engaging in shenanigans. So to me, I think the biggest crime here is that all that angst that's being directed towards some little pizzeria in Westminster, California, that unfortunately trips over the CCPA requirements, we're going to make them do stuff that we're not making the government do. And the government's the one that's going to hurt us a lot more than the pizzeria in Westminster.
I totally agree. And I talk a lot about the hypocrisy of GDPR and how it creates all these carve-outs for EU nation states to essentially conduct sweeping surveillance activities. And then at the same time, European regulators and data protection authorities are critical of the United States through the privacy shield invalidation and the safe harbor invalidation about surveillance practices, when we know they're engaging in the same or even worse practices. So, you know, I call it the grand hypocrisy of data governance, of privacy regulation, which is exactly what you hit on. We're so focused on commercial misuse of data, personal data, that we're overlooking the sweeping, you know, I don't want to say, let's just say misbehavior by governments as it relates to how they're collecting, how they're using all of this personal information about us. And nobody is spending material, meaningful resources to unpack that dark black box, which I'm sure is full of horrors. I totally agree with you. Super
Amen.
positive.
And just reminder of things like no internet company has ever separated children and parents at the border.
Exactly.
That's the kind of power that the government has that no private company will ever have. And no internet company has ever tear gassed peaceful protesters on public streets. They just don't have that power. The government is the one with the power. And every time we're not fighting that power, we're probably misdirecting our energy.
Same page.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Good conversation.
You're welcome. Thanks for putting this together. I don't think we've maximized fully the Bladerunner motif, but we did get to some pretty dystopian outcomes, and so I feel good that we were thematic.
Yeah,
definitely.
Andy, I'm going to say this right now. We're going to do a part 2. We just have to. This is a great combo.
Great conversation. Thank you very much. We'll say goodbye and we'll do a little intro, but we really appreciate you coming on and being. I mean, this is great conversation. Thank you so much.
This was great.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you, friend.
Thanks.